Black Death 1347 to 1351 CE was the first and greatest of the many plague outbreaks of the Second Plague Pandemic in the Middle East, 1347 CE to 1877 CE. While the Black Death's mortality and impact in Europe has received a great deal of attention, the same cannot be said for the case of the Black Death in the Middle East. This study will present newly discovered evidence and a fresh analysis of quantification as part of our ongoing efforts to examine and interpret the mortality of the Black Death in the Middle East. We'll use data and information compiled from medieval Arabic texts, and thus expand upon our recent analyses that have dealt with this subject, 2016-2017. In particular, we examine in this study new data for the Black Death's mortality in Samarkand, Khorasan, Iraq, Andalusia, and North Africa, in addition to our review and re-examination of the data for Egypt and Syria. As our analysis in this study will show, the Black Death in the Middle East had an approximate mortality of 42% in the areas for which we were able to gather sufficient data to make estimates. It stands without question that an event with such high mortality would have had a serious and profound impact on all regions of the Middle East, and this proposes that more studies consider the historical importance and long-term impact of the Black Death. In this context, it's worth emphasizing that the Black Death was only the first in a series. There were over 150 plague outbreaks in the Middle East Second Plague Pandemic, and it was a pandemic far longer in duration than that of Europe. Furthermore, it is clear that severe outbreaks with large-scale mortality occurred over this long interval at a rate of roughly 10 per century. A great deal of work needs to be done in terms of our understanding of how such serious and repeated demographic blows affected the Middle East, socially, economically, and otherwise. Plague is a disease caused by the rod-shaped gram-negative bacterium, Yersinia pestis. Yersinia pestis evolved from the closely related environmental progenitor Yersinia pseudotuberculosis, a mild pathogen that was spread by oral fecal transmission. This event happened quite recently, some 4,000 years ago during the Bronze Age. As it diverged from Yersinia pseudotuberculosis, it acquired the ability to be transmitted by insect vector, primarily the rat flea Xenopsilochiopus. It also developed its high pathogenicity. This was required for the successful infection of its host, primarily the rodent species Rattus rattus, in its new mode of transmission. In this way, Yersinia pestis developed the ability to spread between rodents via fleas, since fleas, in the process of feeding on infected rats, ingest plague bacilli. Yersinia pestis bacilli ingested during the flea's blood meal build up as a biofilm in the flea's proventriculus. The block formed by this bacterial biofilm shuts off the passageway to the flea's midgut, and thereby renders the flea incapable of ingesting its food and drink. The flea then begins to starve and dehydrate, and as it becomes desperately hungry and thirsty, it engages in continuous efforts at feeding, biting the rat host with steadily increasing frequency and in growing agitation as it attempts to relieve the obstruction in its proventriculus. Subsequently, each time the infectious flea attempts to feed, it regurgitates accumulated rat blood into its rat host and thereby delivers to the rat's bloodstream a mass of Yersinia pestis bacilli from its biofilm. The rat becomes sick with plague, and as it weakens and dies, the flea moves on to another rat, infecting it in turn. The zoonosis of rats thus develops, and the rats die in increasing numbers. We are going to illustrate the next steps and subsequent stages of the plague outbreak by means of a model developed by Matthew Keeling and Christopher Gilligan. This model allows us to view this critical stage of the plague event quantitatively, as the 9 differential equations that compose the Keeling and Gilligan simulation draw our attention to the point where the rat zoonosis draws to a close. I would ask everyone to look at the upper left section of the 4-quadrant graph in front of you now. On the x-axis on the graph, time is plotted in days from the moment that the infection began spreading among this rat colony. The number of rats is plotted by the yellow line on the left y-axis, where the initial value is 7,000. That figure actually represents the rat colony's population density, 7,000 rats per square kilometer. On the graph, the rat population can be seen to dwindle to a level approaching zero after 130 days. The rat colony's demise aside, there are two key events depicted here. One of them is shown via the blue line in the lower left quadrant, which can be seen to sweep upward sharply as the rat population crashes. This variable is called the flea index, N, fleas per rat, and it represents the average number of fleas residing on each rat, which in this simulation was initially 6 and has by day 130 risen to 2.5 times that level. What is happening here is that these desperately hungry, thirsty fleas are deserting the bodies of the many rat hosts who have died, which they'll do promptly as the body temperature begins falling, and are now crowding onto the rapidly diminishing number of rats who are still alive. For these rat fleas, this moment is much like the scene of an enormous shipwreck with lifeboats few and far between. And for the sick and dying rats now weakly scratching at the mass of voracious fleas crowding onto their bodies, we can't even imagine how awful this must be. The most important part of this picture, from our human perspective that is the frightening implication of the green line, variable F, so-called free infectious fleas, fleas without a rat host, that has just reached its apex. This line shows the exponential and explosive increase in the number of fleas who have failed to find a living rat as the colony was dying, or they found one which promptly died. These fleas are starved and dehydrated to the point of expiring, as some of them are beginning to do, and they have absolutely nothing to feed on. So this, of course, is the critical moment for humans, living in and around this rat colony, as the rat fleas are now huge in number, chock full, indeed blocked, with masses of plague bacteria and ready to bite into anything warm. Rat fleas, Xenopsilla chiappus, are not adapted to human blood, ordinarily steer clear of such a strange food and drink, but now swarm in huge numbers, 14,000 per square kilometer, into the human population depicted on the right half of this 4-quadrant graph. For humans in the vicinity of this turning point where zoonosis becomes epidemic, this would be the logical moment to run for your life, and to keep running for a long time. As far as we know, no one in the pre-modern world ever made this particular connection of twin trouble signs: the expiring rat colony, invisible to many, and the sudden night attack of endless scratching at swarms of fleas. But the two were always there together as the opening signal for the commencement of human mortality. Human plague fatalities in this simulation thus begin and rise sharply with the end of the rat zoonosis. Bubonic plague fatalities are shown in the upper right quadrant, and lagging these, an outbreak of pneumonic plague is shown on the lower right. Seen here are the 9 differential equations that compose this model for rats, fleas, and humans, and the 18 parameters by which initial conditions are set for rat zoonosis and bubonic plague, plus 7 more for pneumonic plague. What we do in our research with this model is to set initial conditions so as to quantitatively simulate the human plague outbreak, and then plug in the human fatality data we find in medieval Arabic source texts. In 2014, we began modeling plague outbreaks in this fashion and have quantified some 30 outbreaks for Egypt and Syria using the Keeling-Gilligan model.